everybody, welcome back to Making Stuff with Mrs. Baroody. I'm Mrs. Baroody, and today we're going to be talking about watercolor paint. We're going to be talking about how to use our paintbrushes and a couple different paintbrushes that might be helpful. We're going to be learning some techniques about wet on wet and wet on dry, how much water to use, and just some other tips and tricks that I use when I do my watercolors. At the end, I'm going to show you some examples of my practice papers and then how I can take those techniques and ideas and turn it into an actual painting. All right, well, let's get started. All right, ladies and gents, we have here just kind of basic run-of-the-mill tray of watercolors that you can pick up at any craft store. I bet you probably even get it at one of your grocery stores around here. So here we have our brown and our black at either end. We're not really going to use those. We're going to focus more on the primary and secondary colors that are in the middle. I'm going to show you a few tools that everyone should kind of have if they're going to do watercolor, and talk a little bit about the watercolor paper before we get started. So I'm gonna move this over here out of the way. I always like to have a couple different brushes when I'm painting, whether it's watercolor or acrylic. I always like to have a nice round brush. This one has a nice point on it that I can use for corners and edges. And then this is an old brush. He's not in the best condition, but this shape is something we call a filbert. And the filbert brush is kind of shaped like a hand. It's round on top with those straight edges. It's not a flat brush where it would have a flat edge here. It's rounded. This I really like for edging and for filling in the space. You could use an angled brush. You could use a flat brush. These are the two that I kind of like the best. I have my paper cup of water that my brushes are always going to live in. And sometimes I even have 2 cups of water. One that's got nice clean water for my water washes and one that I rinse in. I always have a towel of some kind. You could use paper towel, but usually when my dish towels become a little old and yucky, they get downgraded to art towels. And then on top of that, we have our paper. And you can see on this paper, I've made a whole bunch of lines. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you get really close to this paper, you can see it has a nice rough texture. This is pretty good quality watercolor paper. The stuff we have at school or you might have in your art kits at home is going to be a little thinner. So you want to be careful with the amount of water that you use. It's going to wrinkle that paper a little bit more easily than this. And some artists like to tape down their edges. So if you have a nice surface to work on that isn't your dining room table, you could absolutely tape the edges down, and that's going to help it from curling up when it gets wet. But because I'm working on my dining room table, I'm not going to be taping anything down, and I'm going to avoid the edges so I don't stain it. So before we get started, I made a whole bunch of lines on here. They're just random shapes. And this is where I'm going to practice doing those different techniques that we talked about, wet on wet and wet on dry. Some of my 6th graders and some of my other students, we've worked on it so far this school year. If you haven't worked on it, don't stress about it. So I have my water cup, I have my towel, I have my paint, I have my paper. So the first thing I'm going to do is I load my brush with quite a lot of water on it. Okay. And I'm going to take that and put it over into my color. And I think today we'll start with, let's start with blue because it's my favorite color. When I put this in here, I don't scoop. I'm not violent with what I do. I do nice swirls in the paint to load my brush, but to get this started because I might come back to it. Lots and lots of paint on that brush. I don't like to put this much paint down right away. I'm going to give it a little rinse. And for my kids that like to watch the water turn colors, I'm going to dry my brush off a little bit. I hate when there's water on the handle and it's all drippy because then it might drip on my paper. So I try and make sure that I've dried that off on my towel. So I'm going to pick a spot. I'm going to grab my blue with my brush, and we're going to do wet on dry. That means the paint is wet on my brush, but the paper is dry. And again, I always say this, your paper isn't glued down unless you taped it down. Move it wherever you need to be comfortable. So be very careful on the edges. And you can see, if you watched my video on how to make the perfect straight line, I am pulling that paintbrush towards myself. See how nice that line is? Now, if I took my brush and pushed it, see what happens to the bristles? They get all wonky. We don't want that. We're always pulling our brush. And you can see I got a little bit more water, get a little bit more blue paint, and again, following that edge, pulling my paintbrush. Now, watercolor, not super forgiving, but it's okay, unlike coloring, to maybe go in a different direction. So for this, instead of holding my brush this way, I've now switched it. So I'm using just that straight edge right there to go along this one. But again, I'm still pulling my paintbrush. Trying not to get the paint outside the lines or on my table. Now I have a couple corners I'm a little leery about using that brush in. So I'm going to take out my rounded brush, going to dry off the handle because that drives me nuts. And look how nice and pointy that is because it was in the water and I dried it off just a little bit. This is still damp. I'm going to go into my blue paint and I'm going to go very slowly along that edge. So I'm staying inside. Now that's wet on dry. While this paint is still wet, I could do the next technique, wet on wet. That means I could put wet paint on top of this wet paint. So colors that look good with blue, I could do red, I could do yellow, I could do green, I could do purple. Orange is one I don't want to use. It's not going to look good. So I think let's use some green. So I'm going to get some more water in my brush, giving it a swirly swirl in the green. Okay. Now, once I have green on my brush, if I come through where it was wet already, that green and blue, I can blend it together into a green-blue kind of turquoise color. Now, there's a lot of paint right now, so I don't want to do this too much because I can always come back and I can do wet on dry again. I could wait for this blue to dry and come back and put some green on top of it. So when this dries, it's going to be green and it's going to fade into blue. Nifty noodles. Now to do wet on wet, where we put water down and then we put a color on top of it. That gets a little trickier because your paint, your paper might be not as thick as mine. So it's going to absorb the water a little bit quicker. So you got to work fast. So I know I already have green and blue that's wet. So maybe I'll just use green on this. So I'm taking my water, and because I'm using the water that got tinted blue, it's already kind of tinted a little bit when I put it on the paper. And you can see I'm working a little bit quicker than I was before, still being careful, trying not to go outside the lines. Okay, nice and wet. Now, I can come over here and grab the green, nice and loaded up with green, and I can put it on the water. And see how it kind of goes away from the brush? So this might be a good technique I could use for leaves. If I wanted to make something with some texture, I could leave it all dotted like that. If I wanted it to be solid, I could just use my paintbrush on top of that water and make it solid. Okay, so we have our wet on dry, and then our wet paint on wet paint, and we have our wet on wet with our paint on top of our water. A couple different techniques. Now, while you're doing this practice paper, you could have it set up like this. I'll show you a couple other ways that I set mine up. Things to remember. I shouldn't be painting right next to these guys, because what's going to happen if I get a new color, let's say orange, and I put it right next to where I already painted, it's going to bleed in to where that was, and it's not going to look nice. So while you're doing this, I'm skipping around. So I just did this one and this one. I might move down this. It's far away from everybody else. This guy, things that are touching corner to corner, you might be okay on. So what I want to see you doing is trying to practice this wet on dry, wet on wet. Try dotting, using your paintbrush in the correct way. Remember, we're always pulling our brush strokes. We're never pushing or scribbling. So this is my example that I just made lines on, lots of different shapes. If you want to be a little bit more neat and tidy, you could make columns and rows. And you can see how my paper is curled up, right? Because I didn't tape it down. So for this one, I used a ruler. And all I did was line up the ruler with the edge of my paper and made a line. And then I move it over, line it up with that line, and keep making lines, and then turned my paper into the same thing, boop, 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 all the way across. So that makes me have squares. And I used this color palette, these paints, to make these colors. This column over here, I ended up adding some black and brown to the colors to change them a little bit. And you can see I did some wet on wet. I did wet on dry. I went back over it with another color. This is my practice one. When you're done with this, you don't have to throw it away. You could hang it up on your wall to give you some references, or you can turn it into its own piece of artwork. So this is a bigger one that I used. And for this one, I used this tray of paint. Look how many colors. Awesome, right? And you can see here in its tray, that's where I mixed some of the colors to make the new colors that aren't just here. There's a lot of colors on this tray. And after I was done, I came back through with my Sharpie marker and I drew some little leaves and things. I'm particularly proud of that one. I think I did a pretty good job. So I could, again, leave it like this. I could cut out these squares and use those in a mosaic of some kind. Same thing with this guy. I could cut out these shapes, use them in a mosaic or some other piece of artwork. Once you're comfortable, once you've had a little practice and you think, I got this. I think I'm good at blending these colors. Now you can start making designs with them. So I practiced there with my techniques. And on this one, what I did was drew nice angular shapes, took my ruler, and I did my 1 point perspective. So that's my point in the middle of the paper. I took my ruler, I lined it up with the corner of my shape and drew a line. Lined it up with the corner of my shape and the center, drew a line. So not only do I have 1 point perspective, I also have 3D shapes because now they have different edges to them. And for this, I started at the middle and I used quite a lot of watercolor paint. And as I went out here, I added more and more water because the more water you add, the lighter your paint will be. So dark to light, sort of implying they're going down into that point. I also used black, and be careful because it's a very bossy color. It doesn't like to be covered up with other colors. I was very careful. I used just the very tip of my paintbrush and was really careful and worked my way up. So a lot of paint on my brush. And as I went up, I had more and more water, so the color got lighter. So practice your techniques. You can do it in columns. You could do it in circles. This I just traced the inside of my tape. Did some experimenting with mixing colors, wet on wet, wet on dry, making lines and dragging the color down. Lots of different things you can do. Once you think, yeah, I'm getting this watercolor stuff, I'm pretty good at the blending, I got it. Now the next step you can do is making a watercolor picture. This one I found in my studio. This is from, I don't even know when, but you can see that wet on wet that I did with the purple and the blue to make those mountains. You can see the dry, the wet on dry that I did here, and you can see some of the white still through there, but I think that adds some texture. This one, this part here, your guess is as good as mine. Do you think I did wet on wet? Do you think I did wet on dry? And then I came through with my pen and added some details. Sharpie pen is great for adding details to watercolors. They're very friendly. You can see even in this example, just having that nice black outside edge kind of makes these shapes pop, especially with the black background. So what I want from you guys, practice, practice, practice with the wet on wet technique, the wet on dry, how you're holding your brush, how you're blending your colors. Be creative, okay? And as always, make sure that you're being safe and being kind as well as being creative. And I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.